Proposition 2 is about public schools. It's a general obligation bond that was placed on the ballot by the state legislature. The question it asks voters is, do you want the state to borrow $10 billion to repair and modernize public schools? As background, currently there are 115 community colleges and about 10,000 K through 12 public schools statewide, and that includes about 1,300 public charter schools. Each of these schools is governed by local districts. The facility costs for expansion or repairs are usually split between the state and the school district, with the state paying 50% of the new construction and 60% for renovation. The state mainly uses bonds to pay for their share of the costs. Bond financing is a type of long-term borrowing used to raise money for all types of public infrastructure projects. Over the last 20 years, the most common purposes of bond measures were for water infrastructure and for housing. The state sells bonds to investors and then repays those investors with interest over several years. So instead of paying for the project all at once, the cost is spread over the current as well as the future taxpayers, all who will benefit from an investment that happens over many years. All general obligation bonds the repayment for those general obligation bonds all come from the general fund. The general fund budget for our state is currently $210 billion, and half of that comes from income tax from individuals, and the other half comes from a combination of sales tax and corporate taxes. $80 billion is budgeted for K through 12 schools, $70 billion for health and human services, and then the remaining $60 billion is split between public colleges, jails, and other things. As of January this year, California had $71 billion of outstanding general fund debt and an additional $24 billion of authorized bonds that just had not been sold yet. California's overall bond debt has decreased by almost 50% since the mid-2000s, when several large bonds were authorized, and yearly bond payments have been decreasing slightly over the past 10 years. During the 2022-23 fiscal year, bond payments were about 2.5% of the general fund, which is the lowest the bond payment percentage has been in 20 years. Yet over the next 2 years, it's projected that California could face a $56 billion deficit. Two-thirds approval in both houses of the legislature is required to place a bond on the ballot, and a 50% approval of the voters is required for a state bond to pass. School districts usually use local bonds to pay for their share of the costs, and they must get at least a 55% voter approval to sell bonds. Over the past 20 years, voters have approved $181 billion in local bonds for public schools, and during that same time period, $32 billion in state bonds have been spent on public schools. If Prop 2 receives 50% voter approval, this measure would take effect immediately and do three main things. One is that the state would be allowed to issue $10 billion in bonds. $8.5 billion would go to K through 12 public schools and $1.5 billion to public community colleges. To be considered to receive the funds, school districts would be required to submit a 5-year master plan, and then the funds would be awarded on a first-come, first-served basis. Funds to K through 12 would be split among 4 types of projects: $4 billion for renovation of existing buildings, $3 billion for new construction, including buying land, $600,000 for career technical education program facilities, and $600,000 for public charter schools. The second thing would be that the state's share of both new construction and renovation would increase by 5% for school districts that have a lower assessed property value in their districts and a higher share of students who are low income, English learners, or foster youth. And the third thing Prop 2 would do would be allow more districts to apply for additional state funding. If the districts are unable to raise at least $15 million from their local bonds, which is up from $5 million today, they could apply for that additional funding, and the amount would increase with inflation in future years. According to the Legislative Analyst's Office, which is a nonpartisan state department, The cost to repay the bond is $500 million each year for 35 years, which is less than 0.5% of the state's total general fund budget. After adjusting for inflation, the cost of the bond, including interest, would be about 10% more than if the state paid for it up front. These are not the opinions of the League of Women Voters, but people who support Prop 2 say that 38% of students in California go to schools that don't meet the state's minimum safety standards, and school districts in lower income areas have no way to pay for those improvements. Also not necessarily the opinion of the League, people who oppose Prop 2 say the state would include school repairs, or should include, they say that the state should include the school repairs in its regular budget rather than turn to taxpayers, and lower income districts should be getting a larger share of the state's money. As of August 24th, the total contributions for Prop 2 were $1.4 million. Contributors are mostly construction companies up and down the state, all contributing less than about $100,000 each. As of August 24th, there have been no contributions against Prop 2, yet campaign finance can change dramatically up until Election Day. Updates to campaign contributions can be seen on cal-matters.org, ballotpedia.org, cal-access.sos.ca.gov, and lao.ca.gov. The more money you see contributed to a campaign, the more ads you'll hear and see, either for or against. The least reliable information to base your vote on is any paid advertising, and the media in general requires some effort to determine what is opinion and what is fact. The most reliable sources for facts are the Cal Matters, Ballotpedia, Cal Access, and LAO websites. So what your vote means. A yes on Prop 2 means you want to authorize a bond for $10 billion to fund public kindergarten through community college school construction, renovation, and modernization, and a no on Prop 2 means you do not want to issue these bonds for public schools.